For the fifth episode of Washington's Six Principles series, we are going to discuss money. While people generally love making money, spending money doesn't have the same kind of excitement, shall we say. But it's important that we understand how our country makes money and spends money so that people can know what they're spending on, how they're being spent, and what money can do to further our country for the betterment of society and for future generations. The topic today is fiscal responsibility. Let's begin. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Talosky, with an exclusive episode on the fifth principle of my Washington's Six Principles series. Today's topic is fiscal responsibility, an introduction and an explanation of how fiscal responsibility is so significant in our country's politics. If you like this episode and this podcast, make sure you subscribe and share with your friends and family. Don't miss every episode Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern. Before we launch into our topic today, this is the first episode I'm recording right now after the 2020 elections. And I want to thank all the American voters who faithfully and legally voted in our democratic system. I know that many people are disappointed on both sides of the aisle, seeing that we're seeing a smaller Democratic majority in the House, and most likely a Republican Senate, and a projected winner of Joe Biden for the White House. And I want to kindly remind those, especially those who felt that their side might have lost, depending on the race, depending on where in the country. I want to remind those that elections are not the only way that people can participate in the process. If you want to institute change, there are plenty of other avenues to explore. So I don't want this election or any election to deter people from exercising their rights to express their point of views, because we need opposing views. We need to have counterbalances. We need to look at issues from all sides so that we can make more informed decisions for our democracy. So I hope that people will remain energized and understand that there's still a lot more to do. We have a lot of issues to deal with at this time. Remember, good governance requires effective opposition. And remember that the next election, just make sure to keep fighting. And understand that a civil process is the way forward. And remember what I said in the message before that election. Be there. Support your fellow citizens. Now, let's dive right into fiscal responsibility. Let's explore what fiscal responsibility is not. Fiscal responsibility is not Sherman Talosky telling you how to manage your finances. I'm sure that there are plenty of podcasts and YouTube videos and courses and people who deal with all kinds of activities like taxes and finance management, economics, etc. What I want to focus on today is to understand why fiscal responsibility is a principle. And some people have asked me, why is fiscal responsibility one of your six principles that you believe Washington believed in, and something that Washington would profoundly criticize the current United States on? And it's understandable why he would do so. As with the previous episodes, I'm going to refer to Washington's farewell address again. He discusses public credit. Here's the quote. Quote, as a very important source of strength and security, cherish public credit. One method of preserving it is to use it as sparingly as possible, avoiding occasions of expense by cultivating peace, but remembering also that timely disbursements to prepare for danger frequently prevent much greater disbursements to repel it, avoiding likewise the accumulation of debt, not only by shunning occasions of expense, but by vigorous exertions in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not ungenerously throwing upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. Unquote. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'm not going to go into every word, but let's think about the context for a second. At the time of Hamilton's tenure, or time in the Treasury Department, and at the time of Washington's first administration, one of the big issues that was facing the nation was paying off Revolutionary War era debts. We had a number of militias and volunteers who were promised that they were going to be repaid, assuming everything went well, assuming the war was over and that there was some other entity or authority to reimburse them. But as the years go by, after the treaty signed in 1783, it became more and more difficult for the government to try to make ends meet. In fact, the federal government was virtually bankrupt around the time of Washington's administration. They had to come up with policies on securities and on taxation and other measures to keep themselves afloat. It was not an easy situation. It was so precarious that there were even some insurrections, some protests and riots that occurred throughout the Washington administration. Many of these were opposed to additional taxation, but also were upset that they were not even being compensated enough for what they perceived were heroic duties, and understandably so. Secretary Hamilton's idea was to have the national government take on the state's debts, because after the Revolutionary War, states essentially did not even congregate to become the nation that we know of. There's that debate about whether or not there were 13 countries or just one country. Hamilton's move symbolized something greater than just repayment and just taxation. It represented a new category for how the federal government would assume fiscal responsibility. You see, Hamilton and the Federalist Party knew that the federal government had to compete with states on the repayment plans. Because if every state were to accumulate a state debt, each state would have its own way of issuing bonds and securities with the interest rates, with state banks. It just would have been very difficult. And as Hamilton was thinking, as the Treasury Secretary, he needed to figure out a way to score economic and political points. And he also wanted to ensure that there was a stronger central government in case the economies of multiple states started to fracture and started to erode on the public credit of the United States. And so he made that move, but there was a lot of pushback. In fact, James Madison, a fellow cabinet member, pushed back against it. So did many representatives and senators. Ultimately, Hamilton's plan was passed, and the federal government assumed all the debts collectively. These economic and fiscal policies became so significant that it led to something called the Compromise of 1790, which was a deal made between Hamilton and Jefferson. Now, as many of you know, both of these men were inherently opposed to each other on a lot of issues. Jefferson representing the anti-federalist side, or the more state government side of politics. And the deal was reached. A national bank would be established instead of state banks, the national bank having control over much of the economy across the entire nation. In return, the national capital would be moved down towards the further south of the what is now known as the Mid-Atlantic region, into the area where it is known as Washington, D.C. By the way, I think Hamilton probably thought that Jefferson was literally insane when he proposed having a location in an area like Washington, D.C., because at the time, it was very swampy. It was very dirty. No one really wanted to live there. But then again, I guess it really plays into the imagery that people have on the federal government. But anyway, that was the deal. That was the deal that was made in 1790, and it had huge consequences on the direction of the early nation. So what does this have to do with the quote I read a few minutes ago? Well, the first lesson in fiscal responsibility here in the United States is that we have faced it from the very beginning of the country. And so it is very much an inherent part of the American people. Think about the reasons why the Patriots went against the British during the times of the American Revolution and before, with all the protests that led to it. It was all about taxation without representation. Remember that slogan? No taxation without representation. But that anger towards fiscal policies that were not representative of the people didn't stop with taxation. In fact, the Revolutionary War era debts were among the biggest fiscal headaches for the United States. It was something that contemporaries at the time were probably thinking, oh, this is going to bring down the nation. Again, there were a number of different forces, number of different possibilities and ways that the nation could have struggled with and perhaps collapsed on, but it didn't. The nation's credit system was resilient then, and I would argue that with as many faults as you can point out, it's still the most resilient and the most structurally capable than any other economic system of the world. It's unprecedented. We went from a group of colonies who couldn't even agree on how to tax their own citizens, much less pay off Revolutionary War veterans' debts, all the way to the global economic superpower of the world, with the United States dollar used in approximately 88%, 90% of international transactions. Think about that. That's a really dramatic shift. And we've learned a lot of lessons about the economy. But at the same time, we've also not learned. We have perhaps heeded or turned our heads away from the very failures that have brought down other nations. But I think it's because of the robust system that we've established from the early days of the country to the present day that has made us a robust power. We have to improve on our system without tearing the whole system down. Unfortunately, I'm seeing that on the fringe parts of the political spectrum, there are people calling for a revolutionary teardown of the system. That is so dangerous. I cannot even begin to imagine what the livelihoods of people are going to be like if something like that were to happen, given that in contemporary times, people are already struggling. Amid the COVID-19 pandemic, why risk the livelihoods of countless Americans and countless people around the world just for some fringe ideology? So let's dispel that for now. I want to focus on the fundamentals today. As I mentioned, the first is to recognize that the structure and the integrity of the American economic system wasn't built in a day, but it also has sustained for years and years. And we need to use that as part of our advantage, part of leverage, but also part of for the well-being of countless people. Now let's look at the second point. If we go back to that quote for a second, it says, shunning occasions of expense as one of the ways we avoid accumulation of debt. This leads to my second point of this episode, and that is America is losing touch with fiscal discipline. It seems like a broad statement. One could argue that we haven't balanced the budget since the 1820s or the 1880s or whatever time period people like to reference. There's people who argue that we are going full on overboard that we are not even going to make it past the end of the decade without some kind of financial crisis of epic proportions. Essentially, they're opposite sides of the spectrum on how much we have to spend and how much we should spend. Well, we have to take a more balanced approach. And this is where fiscal discipline comes into play. The problem is when people argue that they need to increase government spending, or that we need to tax more or tax less, or we need to cut spending or cut this program and that program. It's easy to fit them into ideologies, but what are the actual purposes? Did we have an investigation into this program on how it's managed? Can we manage a program better instead of cutting it? Can we lower taxes so that people can get a bit of a boost for their paycheck while ensuring that everything else that has to be paid for, including Medicaid, Social Security, and defense and other appropriations bills, are able to be funded? Fiscal discipline, I think, is something that has to be tied with everything else. It has to be tied with civility. It has to be tied with a kind of education, knowing all the different sides, all the different perspectives, and not just following a political party or a particular ideology just for the heck of it. But something to keep in mind, when I say that we need to understand all perspectives, I don't mean to say that we all have to be those working at H&R Block, or those who develop TurboTax, or those who need to have some kind of expertise. I don't think that that's necessary. There are people who do specialize in those fields. The people working for representatives, for companies, for all kinds of clients who focus on these particular issues. I think what we can do as the American people is to just raise awareness of what people are spending on. Whether it's just looking at reports or voicing concerns about who's going to pay for this, how much our future generations going to pay for this. These are just essential questions. And when someone tells me or anyone else that the voice of the people don't matter, that it has to be left to the experts, I just laugh. I don't think that that is how a civic process should work. Everyone should have a say in what they believe is right, whether or not something is, the best policy or the best way forward is going to be up to the market of ideas that we are all supposed to be engaged in. Again, we can get into these debates about tax policy and whatnot. I want to focus briefly on expenditures. I think it's easy to say that we can spend all this. I want to spend on this program or this policy or that policy, and not have it be your own money. When it comes to spending other people's money, I'm really good at it. You're really good at it. Everyone's really good at it. Everyone has their own idea of what's good for the society and what's good for the state or the country. And we need to have those ideas as part of the free speech environment that we live in. The free speech zone is within the borders of the United States. But I think everyone knows that there have been measures that we might not have voted for, but that passed. And we say, I don't really want to spend on this issue. I don't really want to spend on this program. I don't want to increase spending on this or that. We all know what it's like when we are paying taxes for things that we didn't want. I think we can use that as part of our strategy to call for fiscal discipline. Knowing that people are not going to be agreeing with us all the time, that's okay. But one of the things I've seen over the last several years especially is that we are so fixated on the number of zeros in the national debt or the number of zeros in the expenditures. Last time I checked from the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, for fiscal year 2019, federal expenditure was $4.4 trillion, while our revenue was something along the lines of $3.5 trillion. While we don't have all the answers, perhaps these zeros should be less of a spectacle and more of a warning sign. What do these expenditures mean for myself, for my children, for my grandchildren? These are the essential questions. And these will be questions that we will be exploring further. Everyone's situation is different. Everyone's got different ideas. Let's come together. Let's have a vision for fiscal discipline without any sense of how much money we're spending. There's no way we will be able to pay for this. There's just no way. I think there's no question that the people of the United States have that power to voice their opinions and their concerns for spending. The government is not spending money on its own. It is spending the taxpayers' money. And what they do with it, they should be held accountable. That's how our system works. We will be exploring these topics in more detail. Stay tuned for more episodes on this. So that's one thing. Fiscal discipline, with the rapid rising debt, certainly a lot of expenditures during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm not saying all that expenditure is not worth it. I'm just saying that there are provisions that should be investigated, should be looked into. But in general, fiscal discipline has become a lost art. I just don't think we have gotten to a point where we can truly grasp the attention of our lawmakers and tell them, who is going to pay for this? Why should future generations pay for what you are asking for? And if a lawmaker or someone else can't answer that question, then maybe that person's arguments are not as strong as they claim to be. So there you go. Fiscal discipline has been a lost art. I think we need to re-energize that again in this country. The final thing I want to say today, it's a very simple lesson, but I think it has to be put on the record. And that is, nothing, not even freedom, is free. There's a cost to everything. I want to share a couple examples with you to illustrate my point. After speaking with some families, one of the lessons that I've heard from them is that they appreciate the food and many other aspects of life even more than they ever did before. Take the innocent example of a jar of peanut butter. The farmers who grew the peanuts, the manufacturers who added all the ingredients and brought them to a manufacturing plant, all the machines that have to be maintained to process and make the peanut butter, the containers and the labeling and all that all has to be put on a truck or perhaps an aircraft, depending on where you live. That had to be transported to a supermarket, had to be unloaded, prepared by the store employees. There's so much that goes into our system of the way of life. And maybe one of the critical pillars of fiscal discipline and fiscal responsibility is just knowing that we live in a network of different industries. And when we incur a cost on one area of the economy, we are incurring costs on other people whom we might never meet. And the point of this example is to show that fiscal discipline is, in part, recognizing the many networks and the many people who contribute to our way of life. We may not meet these people in person. There's just too many people to meet. But it's a really important value that I think makes fiscal discipline come alive a bit more. The next time we enjoy our favorite dish or a favorite ride on the amusement park roller coaster, so many people have to be in play, and that's how society works together. Not in a union way, but in multiple overlaps of interest and of occupations. That's what keeps the society together. And if we lose track of that, if we just say, just spend away, don't care about the checkbook, don't care about the account numbers, if we give it all away, I think we are fundamentally losing the essence of how our country is built, not just on an economic level, but on a cultural level. My second example comes from universities and colleges. And as a disclaimer, I don't say this to portray all college students. But I think it's very strange in my conversations as a college student talking with others. I've often been hearing the same kinds of arguments and calls for free tuition and free this or subsidize this, subsidize that. And all it takes is just that fundamental question that I asked before, which is who is going to pay for this? More importantly, I asked these people, are you going to pitch in or are you just going to sit by and watch other people pay for your tuition? And oftentimes I just don't get a response, or get a response along the lines of, well, everyone needs to go to college. Education is a fundamental right, etc., etc. This is what's really sad about many people who fit in this category, which is that there's no even understanding of how hard people work to pay for taxes. No understanding of even just simple math. People can disagree and agree on tax policies and tax rates. The fundamental fact is that the most elite and richest people in the world, by the numbers, pay for a lot of the tax revenue. I mean, if you're going to tax someone who's worth over $1 billion, you're going to get a lot of tax revenue out of them by the numbers. Let's start with the facts first and then debate on whether or not we should increase or decrease or keep the same tax rates. We cannot afford to allow young people and others from taking on this view that everything is free or that people can just demand that everyone gives them free stuff. That's not how society works. One person's free stuff is another person's cost. Remember, nothing is completely free. There's always a cost. Can I just add that economics, I think, should be a critical part of curriculum across the United States, knowing that there's an opportunity cost. And when we choose to do something, there's going to be something that we are not doing. For example, if we can choose to either go to the movie at 6 p.m. or go to the soccer game at 6 p.m., the opportunity cost of going to the movie is the cost of going to the soccer game, because you can't do two things at once. All revolves around scarcity. And perhaps one key lesson that we can all learn is that resources are scarce. Everything from money to food to water to land to air, everything is scarce. Let's act on them. Let's not go into these absolute terms as I've just illustrated with this example of free stuff or free tuition that I've heard a lot from college students. Let's get back to reality and focus on what we have to agree on in terms of the facts, and then go from there, and then have active conversations and debates. That's how we move forward. So to recap, fiscal responsibility is part of the American debate in politics. It always has been. It's a part of our history. From the no taxation without representation movement to the debates about Hamilton's ideas for a national bank and for assuming state debt, to the debates on tariffs and on expenditures such as the big initiatives during the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt, to the reorganization of government after the Second World War. There's so much history on fiscal responsibility and the debates on how the country's finances and economics could be resolved. We should accept that as part of our civic religion, shall we say. Secondly, fiscal responsibility, and more specifically fiscal discipline, is not as big of a practice anymore. We have been, again, fixated maybe too much on the zeros. and focus on maybe we need fewer zeros in that number. And lastly, we need to constantly remind ourselves that nothing is free, not even freedom. There's always somebody out there paying for something, and that could be you, and that could be me. It's a universal truth, but I just want to emphasize that today. And going forward in this podcast, we're going to be building on these ideas. And knowing that if we can unify behind these ideas and move forward as a podcast, but not just a podcast, as a people, we can achieve so much. We can learn so much from each other. And perhaps we can make a more equitable society. And that will wrap up today's episode on the introduction of fiscal responsibility as a principle for Washington. I know that Washington's lessons during his administration, the difficulties that he had to encounter as the first president, those lessons have been carried forward throughout all the different presidencies and all the different Congresses to this day. Let's cherish those lessons. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. There are plenty of other episodes for you to check out and listen to. Make sure you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. I really appreciate your support. Enjoy your day and your week, and I'll see you next time. So long.